Celine, welcome back. Another
Hey,
newsroom, finally.
I know it's been a bit.
It's been a while since we did one. Yes, or we did an episode. So, looking at the structure of the usual structure of a newsroom, we start with e-privacy and legal updates. And so, on the enforcement side, I read about a lawsuit against Segment, or rather Twilio, who owns Segment now. What do you know about that one?
The complaint was would seem to be against the app, Calm. It's a meditation app, collects some personal data,
Yes.
lots of behavior. But interestingly, the lawsuit is not against the maker of the app. The lawsuit's against Twilio, which produces Segment, which is an SDK for people who aren't familiar with Segment. It's because it's not an app. It's what's underpowered or it's underlaying the app, right? Um, and and so it's really fascinating to see an enforcement action against not even the app developer, but really the underlying technology. Segment is in a lot of places. It's an SDK that's used in a lot of applications that we use every day on our phone. Twilio has been really at the forefront of developing this technology. Just so to see this one under scrutiny, um, it's going to be really interesting to see how this plan plays out. This one could have some waves.
Yeah, it's like going after the data processor instead of
Yeah.
the controller. From a European,
Yeah.
using European terminology, and but the thing is, it's also the first case where I see a CDP because we've talked about customer data platforms a lot, even though this is like the old generation CDP, as Tejas Manohar would say, the CEO from High Touch that we once interviewed here, in the sense that they were more focused on optimizing the data collection and attaching signals to a single identity and all that. So it's got many ramifications, right? You could look at it as I'm going after the technology instead of the app, and then the fact that it's a technology that is going to help us or help all of these companies put together all of the signals around a single customer or identity. So it could go very
Well,
far.
and one other thing that's interesting about it is that the complaint has been filed under the Wiretap Act, which has been used before, but it's not under one of our current new privacy laws, right? Um, the Wiretap Act has been around there for a little bit, right? So it's interesting. So
Yeah, why would that be? Is there more precedent and more certainty, therefore?
I think it's just another avenue, right? It's federal, right? So they've got federal and California
Yeah, yeah,
um,
I saw they split it. Like
statutes.
if
Yeah.
you're a
So
California resident and you have the app, or if you just have the app, and
yeah,
therefore Twilio is gathering your data.
yeah. It's I don't know. This one could have, depending how this one, we could talk in another quarter. Next quarter, we could be talking about this and how it
Yes,
got tossed out, or 2 years from now at the
yes,
speed of the courts right now. So it's going to be a while before this is going to affect anything, I think.
yes, yes. Okay, good. So let me then tell you about Uber.
Yeah, it's a pretty massive fine that they were just levied.
Yeah. So it's 290 million euro, which is like 320 million dollars, and it is about Uber driver data. So data about their drivers being sent, being processed in the U.S. And but it is quite complex what's been happening. So the fine is basically saying that Uber did not have enough safeguards to to send data over to the US. The reality, if you look at the timeline, it's really more nuanced. So if you look at 2020, the Schrems judgment killed the privacy shield, right? So that is a means of adequacy. So plan A under the GDPR. If you're sending data away from the European Economic Area, then the first thing you look for is adequacy. So the European Commission will say this country is adequate. The US is not adequate, but under the privacy shield, the companies in the list were deemed adequate. So once the CJEU, through the Schrems 2 decision, killed adequacy or killed the privacy shield, we always have plan B, which is what we call appropriate safeguards. One such safeguard, one of these, is standard contract clauses. The problem is that the same decision also sort of mutilated plan B. They mutilated standard contract clauses in the sense that they required additional safeguards. So the European Commission had to release a new series of templates because it's the EU Commission that issues the standard contract clauses or SCCs. But they took a while. And they were released in June 2021. So nearly a year later, we had the new standard contract clauses, and then they required that every company switch to the new version by the end of 2022, but that every new contract after September 2021 was subject to the new SCCs, to the new template, if you follow me. So then the European Commission eventually released an FAQ saying that the GDPR, if the GDPR applied to a non-EEA company directly as per territorial scope, so Article 3, then the new template, the new standard contract clauses, would not work. They would not apply to that scenario, but that they planned to release a version, a specific version for such scenario. And Uber was facing a joint controllership situation. You had Uber USA as a joint controller with Uber BV or whatever it's called in the Netherlands. So that means that Uber drivers were agreeing to the terms and agreeing to send data over to Uber in the US as part of the contract. So once the European Commission said in their FAQ that the new SCCs would not apply to that scenario where the GDPR applies directly to the US entity, therefore it's not data being sent from the European entity to an American company, for it to be processed in data under certain agreement, then what they did, so Uber BV did, is withdraw the deprecated standard contract clauses and instead rely on what under the GDPR I call Plan C. So Plan A, adequacy. Plan B, for example, standard contract clauses. What's Plan C? It's Article 49, derogations. Derogations, there's a few of them, but in theory they have to be incidental or sort of a one-off. Like, for example, the contract, which is the specific derogation that they relied on in this case, so that you needed to send data over in order to fulfill your side of the contract, right? So, and they also understood that a series of processing activities could also fall within this sort of incidental condition. So then the fine is looking at that period of time between, I believe it's August 2021, when Uber discarded the SCCs, the deprecated SCCs from the data sharing agreement, from their app, from their terms, and the time when the Joe Biden executive order arrived, which is October 2022, right? Eventually, in July 2023, we would have the data privacy framework replacing the old privacy shield. So therefore, adequacy would return. But in that period between August, when they said, oh, look at the FAQ, they said that it doesn't apply to us, and the old SECs, again, have been deprecated. So let's just rely on the only instrument left, which is Plan C, meaning derogations. But by looking at that time, the Dutch Data Protection Agency found that the data had not been subject to enough safeguards, and there you are, 290 million euro as a fine. So it feels quite unfair in the sense that it's very unpredictable, very hard to know what to do, and that's why I do not like to see an oversimplification of this fine out there. I think you need to look at all of the details, look at the timeline, and even though we may hate Uber or any other company because of the culture or the culture they used to have, I think when you look at the details, we can all agree that something is wrong with data transfers and how they are enforced.
Yeah, I mean, there's no clarity on it. And then to your point, it's a procedural technicality. They attempted to follow the law, but if we're doing the Schrems countdown, we had Schrems 1, Schrems 2, we're moving into Schrems 3. So what's going to happen next?
Yeah, exactly. And Celine, what do you think of the FTC audit, the latest audit? So this summer, on I think it was July, they audited some websites and found, I think, dark patterns all over the
Well,
place.
that is two of my favorite topics when it comes to privacy, right? Uh, the FTC actions right now are super interesting under Lena Khan. She's really leading the charge for privacy, really leveraging, you know, uh, the the authority that they have for unfair and deceptive practices, right? It's really fascinating to see this used across the board. And I like to call them deceptive patterns. The dark patterns less so, but whether it's California or the FTC, it's really exciting to see enforcement actions here. And I think this was less of an enforcement and much more of a, hey, we audited your website and here's a big warning, fix this, they're not okay. So we have CNIL in France in 2022 took some big actions, big steps against Facebook, against Google for having deceptive patterns. The CPPA has legislated against them here in California. But it really feels, and I don't know if it's an awareness in it or an education issue for developers and designers of apps and websites, or if it's a very deliberate or intentional, well, they're not going to catch us, we'll do it anyway. But it just feels like they're not going away. We have conversations about deceptive patterns every year. Something new pops up. So what I like about this is, the FTC is putting everyone on notice that, hey, this is something that we're looking at right now, right? Um, so
Well, but there is a direct contradiction with the Silicon Valley sort of playbook, with every rule about converting, about making sure that people don't churn.
right.
There's these books like Hooked. There was a book back in the
Yeah,
day, I
I
mean, not
remember
so
that.
old, called Hooked. It was
Yeah.
like a bestseller for all of the founders on what you do to get more people to sign up by basically using many of these things. Today we would probably call them dark patterns.
Right. It's true. It's uh, you and I both grew up in sales and biz dev and marketing tools and technology back in the day, right? And the fact of the matter is when things started to become data driven, these little changes in website UX and website design, making something gray and the other one bright green and flashing, um, you know, these little tricks work, these little hacks work, right? Whether it's getting someone to click the button that you want to accept, whether it's, using some really unclear language or a double negative, or making it hard to cancel a subscription. We've seen a lot of major companies have to take big steps. Um,
Yeah,
but for every big company that's taking a big step loudly, I don't know how many times a day I'm faced with your favorite, a cookie banner. It's a
yeah,
great example, right? It says, yes, I accept. And then in light gray font with no button, it says, for more information on
yeah.
how to manage, so I'm excited to see an enforcement action. I guess that's the net for it on deceptive patterns in the FTC for me. So we'll see what
Yeah.
comes out of this notice.
Okay, good. So then, moving on to legal updates and to guidelines. So, what do you think of this, of the AI bill in California? What's happening? Because all I read in the news is there's like two fronts, and I read
Yeah.
about Anthropic somehow supporting it because they managed to influence the
hmm
final sort of
They,
shape of the bill.
yeah.
What's that?
Well, so right now, this bill is sitting on the governor's desk. It's passed the Senate and the Assembly in California, and it's getting ready for a signature. I don't have a lean on what I think is going to happen, whether he's going to sign it or not. But it's been really interesting, I think, for a couple of reasons. Well, more than a couple. This one, first off, it's another example of California just deciding, hey, there's no comprehensive federal law. There's not going to be one for a while because we don't even have comprehensive privacy law yet, federally in the United States. So one more area where California is just saying, okay, we're going to go build this law about AI, right? And on one hand, I think it's trying to be a framework or a catch-all type of law that addresses all of these concerns about how, AI is going to take over the world and do all these bad things, right? We can't give AI the nuclear codes, and it's an existential threat. So, I mean, I could talk about that one for hours, but I'll focus on the legislation itself. I think, A for effort. I think the bill needs a little bit more focus. It's really, really broad. Um, it addresses, you had mentioned Anthropic actually provided some amendments, and not all of them were accepted, but some of them were. You've got Anthropic supporting it. You've got OpenAI opposing it. You've got Elon Musk going back and forth on it. The lawmakers are split even within parties. But it's interesting, it defines covered entities by the size of the compute model and the cost of it. So that's a really interesting way. We haven't seen that in a lot of laws before, right? So at $100 million training threshold,
Yeah.
you're really talking about, the so-called frontier labs or Anthropic and OpenAI and the big names, right? As it sits on the governor's desk, there's no action for a potential harm. Those were stripped out. So there's only civil actions for actual harms caused, right? Which is great. However, it doesn't really do anything to guard against the development of bad practices, right? It only looks at them in arrears. It relies on developer attestations, right? That they've taken reasonable care in developing these. It has a really long data retention requirement, which it'll be interesting. I haven't dug down into the details, but is that in conflict with other,
Yeah,
frameworks,
exactly.
NIST or HIPAA? What lives there? And it has, it convenes a consortium of industry and government experts, and also requires a feasibility study. It started out as establishing a public cloud in California. And now it's just they're going to do a feasibility study by 2027. So if you think about how fast the technology has advanced and been adopted in the last 2 years, we're talking 2.5 years from now, we're going to have a feasibility study on how to regulate AI. I don't know. I think it needs more work, but um, you know, we'll see. This one might get played out in courts.
Well, it's a
So
good breakdown. Well, thank you, thank you. Um, Look, there's something else
I was going to
coming out of,
say California.
again, yes, and I really like this one. So this new proposal, AB 3048, is going to oblige the browsers to implement the opt-out signal. So I like that. And why do I like it? Because we've seen all of these laws, right? Even Colorado and Connecticut, asking businesses to respect the global privacy control signal. Sometimes global privacy control is one of many, right, supported signals. So it's not tied to the specific standard. But how are you going to do this if in the end, no matter how good you are at respecting the signal as a business, it's not practical because Chrome or Edge are not going to support it. So if it's only going to be deployed on Firefox and Brave, then what's the value, right, in terms of adoption? So if now, thanks to this, Chrome is obliged to, at least Chrome for now is still Google's. We'll see what happens in a while, right? With all of these recent,
Right.
competition cases open, but it's still number one. So if Chrome is forced to implementing the global privacy control, then we close the circle, and
That's
I think that's really great news.
Yeah, no, I think this one's a really it's a small one, but it can have some big impact, for those of us privacy nerds who actually read privacy policies and terms of use agreements. It's so many websites that you look at, oh, it's too hard to implement. It's too hard to respect. We don't pay attention to them. But if it's browser based, it changes it,
Yeah.
right? And that's why industry is against the law, because then they run the risk of, oh, now everybody will be able to use this. So, um, I think that industry will be able to innovate new ways of tracking. I have, lots of
Of
faith
course.
that they'll be able to solve this problem. But
Yes,
I
yes.
think this is a good start. So we'll see. It's almost on the governor's desk, not quite. But it's been enrolled, which, California, that just means they're basically proofing and editing and making sure that everything looks the way it was supposed to look. But it'll be on the governor's desk soon.
That's
So,
really good. I mean, at least before concerned banners take over the US as they did in Europe. Okay, and then what about the FTC? I thought this was very, very strong, and it happened this summer as well, in the past, a few weeks ago. So the FTC came out and said that hashing email addresses does not result in anonymizing personal data. How do you, what do
well,
you think about that?
two things. One, California and the FTC seem to be themes in our newsroom today. Two of my favorite things. Um, I, this one to me just feels like, yes, if you're in technology, you kind of already know that. Um, it's not you if you look at labs groups that have worked on this, researchers that have looked at this, they've proven time and time again that you can de-anonymize, right? And that hashing is not really that strong. It sounds strong. Back in the day it was strong, but not so much anymore. So once again, having the FTC come out with a statement very
Yeah.
specifically and directly saying that, hey, for the purposes of any law that says you need to anonymize things, hashing's not the way to do it. And, hashing's, I, everybody hashes. So,
Yeah. I mean, in the EU, this was pretty obvious because we've had all the cases about what's anonymous data, what's pseudonymized data. Uh, do you separate it? Do you keep it together? But it's good that now in the US, that's also being clarified because all the debates we've been having around data clean rooms, which we may have touched upon later, and all of the all of the identity-based alternatives to cookies. In the end, I think that's probably one of the reasons why the FTC had to come out and say it, because all these websites are collecting email addresses or phone numbers, and it's a hushed version of these that is used to replace cookies as a means to deduplicate audiences across third-party websites and environments and so on. Speaking of which, let me move on to MarTech and AdTech very briefly. So in MarTech and AdTech, news but no news. Google is going to keep third-party cookies after all, so
should
no
be
surprise for
no
me.
surprise, right? So it just took them a few years. This one made me laugh when the news came out because I kept thinking, wait, did we know this already? We knew this already, but we didn't know this already, right? So um
Yeah,
what's interesting about this announcement now is watching the whole industry that has sprouted up around cookie deprecation, right? um, Scrambling now to try and find another business model, right? For their technology. So that's actually for me, that's what's interesting about the final announcement that they're not going to do it after all,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. It is interesting. So we've had some interviews and some other episodes about this one, so we're not going to linger on that. But then also connected with this and connected with the new world of first-party data, wherever that leads. So Netflix, I do not have the details, but I know that they announced new uh, deals with data partners. So environments like data clean rooms we've had in the show here, we've had InfoSum and we've had Decentric. They announced a partnership with InfoSum, for example, and they announced new tools, new capabilities for advertisers. And that's very much connected with what we just said about the FTC and hashed email addresses, hash data, because in the end, Netflix is offering advertisers the ability to find their audiences on the Netflix platform. But I have no clue about the specifics. Do you know anything else about
Well,
that one?
when we're looking at data clean rooms just generally, it's another one of those things that, it makes a good press release, right? We're going to be using data clean rooms. It's great for advertisers. It's great for privacy. But really it's just another place to trade more first-party data with, data broker clean rooms, right? All the major data brokers and exchanges have their own clean rooms, right? That they can let you into. You have all the major retailers and online properties, Netflix is one, Disney's another. And you have companies now that are running data clean rooms. So it's interesting. It's not an exchange, but now you're actually exchanging your insights with another third party, right? So is this better for privacy or is it worse?
Yeah, yeah. Okay, good. And then, so moving on to AI competition and digital markets, which is a big chapter, but there's very few things to say here. So one of them, yes, Google search was found to be a monopoly. In the first case, there's these two cases um, presented by the DOJ, by the Department of Justice in the US. So the first one is not this one that is about ad tech that is starting now, but this is the one about Google search. So yes, it is a monopoly, and yes, that kind of deal with Apple to be the default search for the modest sum of $20 billion a year, it seems like it wasn't kosher. And Apple is also facing some scrutiny. So in the EU, under the Digital Markets Act, so this new tool to demand that they, as gatekeepers, open up a little bit. And they had already presented some measures to the European Union. The European Union thought they were insufficient. So now European users will be able to both use an external app store. Let's see how those work. For example, Epic Games has already one in place. And also to change default settings across some core services. And maybe that will spread. We saw that happening in Japan as well, where they're asking them to, to separate control over the device over control of the App Store. And I'm very happy this is happening. I've been asking for something like this for like 7 years.
This one to me seems fairly cut and dry in what the complaint is. And in Europe, the question would be if they're making changes to at the iOS level, will that cause a ripple effect and just make that a generalized change that they make across the iOS, regardless of where the products are? Two major markets already affected. It's good to see it happening in Europe. And hopefully, like I said, I think, hopefully it's going to cause some waves and we'll
Yeah,
see some changes in the US as well.
yeah. Well, Celine, thank you. Thank you very much. It was very good.
Thank you, Sergio. It's been fun.
Thanks for your insights.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, that's all for today. Please follow the Masters of Privacy channel on LinkedIn if you want to find some interview transcripts, cheat sheets, and other useful resources and surprises every now and then. On top of that, episode notes and other feeds are available on mastersofprivacy.com. Thank you for listening.